This goes all the way back to where he was an early adult, and he seemed to have no problem taking credit for other people's ideas, passing them off on his own, and then enjoying the success that actually came with it.
The Liberals and mainstream media have tried to convince Canadians that Mark Carney should win the next election because of his resume alone. Well, the trouble with giving people a resume is that there are people who will actually read it. And of the people who actually read it, there are some who will actually verify everything on it. For example, Mark Carney wrote his doctoral thesis with a paper called The Dynamic Advantage of Competition. Now, there are allegations of blatant plagiarism with his paper, indicating that he took credit for ideas he didn't come up with.
Let's take a look. National Post, exclusive. Mark Carney faces plagiarism accusations for 1995 Oxford doctoral thesis.
Ottawa. Liberal leader Mark Carney has been accused of taking other people's ideas as his own in the federal election campaign. It isn't new. The National Post obtained a copy of Carney's 1995 thesis for his doctorate in economics from Oxford University titled The Dynamic Advantage of Competition. It shows 10 instances of apparent plagiarism according to the judgment of 3 university academics who reviewed the material. In several sections of his thesis, Carney used full quotes, paraphrases, or slightly modified quotes from 4 previous works without proper acknowledgement or attribution. Quote, he's just directly repeating without quotations. That's what we call plagiarism, end quote, said Jeffrey Signolet, an assistant professor and member of UBC President's Advisory Committee on Student Discipline, which handles plagiarism cases for the university. The National Post provided the 10 examples to Carney's campaign team. He was sworn in as Prime Minister on March 14th and is currently running in an election that will be held April 28th. Carney's campaign at first provided a statement from his doctoral supervisor at Oxford University. Quote, I believe you're mischaracterizing this work. As an academic of nearly 40 years, I see no evidence of plagiarism in the thesis you cited, nor any unusual academic practices, end quote, said Margaret Meyer, official fellow of economics at Nuffield College, in the provided statement. Quote, Mark's thesis was evaluated and approved by a faculty committee that saw his work for what it is, an impressive and thoroughly researched analysis that set him apart from his peers, end quote, added Meyer. Oxford University defines plagiarism as, quote, presenting work or ideas from other sources as your own by incorporating it into your work without full acknowledgement, end quote. A professor who is also a graduate from Oxford University, speaking on background out of fear of being sued by Carney, agreed that the problematic passages in the Liberal leader's thesis would fall within the plagiarism definition. Quote, Oxford's guidelines are not atypical from other universities, end quote, he said. Quote, when you have something lifted verbatim from a source in there without quotation marks or citation, that constitutes plagiarism, end quote, added the professor. Oxford University administrators were also provided the 10 examples of apparent plagiarism but did not respond to a request for comment by the deadline. Thursday evening, hours after sending Mayer's statement, a spokesperson for the Liberal campaign, Isabella Orcozo-Madison, called the allegations of plagiarism an, quote, irresponsible mischaracterization, end quote, of Carney's work. While Carney refers extensively in his thesis to Michael E. Porter's 1990 book, The Competitive Advantage of Nations, he duplicates part of Porter's work and presents several sentences, sometimes with minor tweaks to the wording, as his own. In one paragraph on page 206 of Carney's thesis, the similarities are especially stark. Carney wrote, quote, first, government intervention can impede international competition and artificially support domestic profits, end quote. Later, he adds, quote, second, in an industry or an economy where many firms are following harvesting strategies, firms may maintain profitability even though they are losing competitiveness, end quote. Those are virtually the exact sentences that can be found in Porter's book on page 797, except Carney added the extra determiner, quote unquote, and and the adverb, quote unquote, even. He did not use quotation marks or add a footnote to reference Porter's work anywhere in the entire paragraph.
So let's just pause on this one, because I've had to write a bunch of papers in my school career. Tanya's had to write, some of hers. She's actually published some articles in some veterinary magazines. This is not really a gray area when you're doing this
Academia?
type of work.
Yeah.
If you're using an idea that somebody else came up with and you're not directly quoting it, you don't quote it, but you add a footnote.
Right.
And
Those are the little numbers that you often see when you're reading academic papers.
Right. And that way, if you want to see, where that idea came from or that original person's original context of that idea, you could then go to the book and the passage and the page and then look it up and, give yourself more context.
Well, and it even extends outside academia. I mean, here on Northern Perspective, we didn't just try to pass off this National Post article as our own.
Yeah, we did all the investigative work.
We said it came from the National Post, and there's going to be a link to it in the description of this video. So, I mean, that's what you do. You give credit where credit is due. It's not that you can't talk about the things that other people have written or that other videos that people have done, but you have to give proper credit.
Right. Now, the other thing is that when you are directly quoting somebody, then you have to put the actual quotes there, but also, again, another footnote to reference where you actually got that from. You can't just change some words and then say, oh, well, now it's an original thought, now it's an original idea, and I can take credit for it. No, you cannot do that. If you're rewording a quote, then you still have to cite it with a footnote. Now, why is this important? Well, here's the thing. He is writing this as a doctoral thesis. He's literally trying to come up with something new in order to achieve his doctorate. So in order to evaluate that, the people that are actually looking at what he's writing are evaluating him, A, on his writing, and B, on his ideas. Now, this was done back in the 80s and 90s when, guess what? It was really hard to just compare, one document to another. There was very limited software, A, that could do that. And in a lot of cases, these weren't submitted electronically. They were just, in many cases, for those of us that are old enough, you submitted them on a typewriter and said, here you go. Or you hand wrote them all out. That's how it was done. So it's going to be very difficult unless these people they have almost semi-photographic memories to say, wait a minute, I remember that passage from this book by this guy, and that's plagiarism.
Yeah, usually it's academics that have worked with the original author that then they're looking at your paperwork going, you didn't create this yourself.
So the issue is that if he is passing off their ideas as his own, and then he goes on to write even further about it, it calls the entire passage or potentially the entire paper into question. So this is the importance of citing and how to properly cite them. So here's an example that the National Post cites of what Carney wrote in just one example in his thesis and what the original was. So Carney wrote, there are 3 reasons why domestic profitability is not a good indicator of true international competitive advantage. And then the original. Domestic profitability is not a good indication of true international competitive advantage for 3 important reasons. So he's essentially just rewording what the original was and hoping it passes off. So later, he steals from another author, and the original says, in a steady state signal jamming equilibrium, managers will borrow a constant amount each period from the next period's earnings, and the market will correctly anticipate this borrowing. Carney says, in the steady state equilibrium, the managers will borrow a constant amount each period, and the market will correctly anticipate this borrowing. Here's another one. Original. The setting for the game is a pure exchange economy with a finite number of states. Carney. The setting for the game is a pure exchange economy with a continuous number of states. Some people will say, okay, well, who cares? Who cares about a doctoral thesis paper that he wrote 2 decades ago? Why do I care? Everybody's done it. Well, not everybody's done it. Here's the issue. That doctoral thesis paper allowed him to go from Oxford straight to Goldman Sachs, because they hired him based on his resume. They hired him based on his doctoral degree. And then he worked at Goldman Sachs for about 10 years. Does he get that job without that doctoral degree? We don't know. But it calls into question his morality and his commitment to integrity or lack thereof. Considering you have all of these examples, which you can't really dispute, where he's wording it the exact same way, in some cases verbatim, and doesn't cite it. So you then have to take that into his business practices and how he operates. And
we see that with the campaign that the Conservatives have been saying things for a very long time, for months and months, over a year even, and then the Liberals are taking that and using that as part of their platform.
And not even addressing the fact that for the previous 2 years, they were demonizing the Conservatives and everyone who disagreed with it. Remember when they said this, that anyone who disagrees with the carbon tax is denying climate change. You're a climate denier. The planet will burn.
Right. We all want to see the planet burn. If we're going on road trips, we're keeping our kids in the car for 10 hours at a time without a bathroom break, and we're setting the planet on fire.
Let the planet burn. Let the planet burn.
Let the planet burn.
Let the planet burn.
Good news, kids. You can take a summer fun time vacation where you're locked in a car for 10 consecutive days, nonstop with no bathroom breaks, and the Conservatives have a plan for you to have that summertime fun. And the cost? Give up the future of the planet, right? Don't worry, kids, about climate change. Don't worry about taking action on the planet. Enjoy your 10 hours in the car and let the planet burn.
Mr. Mark Holland for a proper citation. So then all of a sudden they say, well, we're going to cancel the carbon tax because Canadians, have said that they don't like it.
You've been saying that for years, dude.
Yeah, now you've decided, that you don't like it because it's right before an election.
And they didn't even cancel it properly. They just kind of put it on pause for the next 60 days. We'll see what happens when Parliament comes back.
So the Conservatives have said, we're going to axe the capital gains tax. Liberals followed suit with that. Conservatives said, well, we're going to break down all the interprovincial trade barriers. Liberals followed suit with that. Conservatives say we're going to give an income tax break. Liberals followed suit with that. Like it's like point for point for point for point. Conservatives have been saying for a while now, we're going to unleash our energy sector, build pipelines, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Liberals have had legislation that prevents the building of pipelines. Yet here's the interesting thing. They say now they're open to building pipelines, but they don't say at all that they're going to repeal Bill C-69, which makes it very problematic to build pipelines in Canada. So they say they're going to do all these things, but it's going to be even more smoke and mirrors because they're not talking about the legislation in order to deal with them. They say that, well, we're going to make Canada a safer place. They don't talk about the fact that they still have legislation in there that allows violent offenders to get out on bail. So there's a lot of dishonesty that seems to be going on with the Liberal Party. And this is why the National Post talks about this thesis that that Mark Carney wrote, because this goes all the way back to where he was an early adult, and he seemed to have no problem taking credit for other people's ideas, passing them off on his own, and then enjoying the success that actually came with it. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I think in this election, we need to give credit where credit is due for all these ideas and attribute them properly to the Conservative Party and allow them to enjoy the success of winning so Canadians can enjoy the success of an actually prosperous and safe country.